mic is muted. There we go, my mic was muted. So how professional. Live streams are... Do you know what? I'm going to challenge myself over the next few weeks to do as many LinkedIn live streams as possible. Just to do it, you know, just for some content, hopefully some interaction. Live streams can be... They're not I don't find them nerve-wracking, right? It's just making sure you've got all the right buttons set up and you've got your mic unmuted, which generally helps. I hope I'm not coming over too loud. I'm not monitoring my audio, but I can see it on the screen. So what I'm going to do in this live stream is just cover off some stuff that we've got on the Podcast Studio Glasgow blog. You can find it at podcaststudioglasgow.com. Click through to free advice for podcasters. Is that the link? No, there's a link that says for podcasters, then blog. And you can find all the latest blog articles we've got there. I'm going to cover off a couple of them, and I'm going to cover off a couple of things, or one thing really, from our Twitter or X account. X, formerly known as Twitter. You can follow us there, x.com/podcast Glasgow, or just at podcast Glasgow on X. We're going to start using that more to put lots and lots of free information, or any news articles that we've found here at the studio. We'll put them out on our X account. So this is quite a big time of year for Scottish podcasters, because in the next, what's today's date, the 24th, within about 2 weeks, entries for the Scottish Podcast Awards are actually due to close. So if you didn't know this already, Scotland is having its own, or its first, Scottish Podcast Awards. They've got the website there, Scottish Podcast Awards.scot. And the awards are going to take place as a live event Thursday the 25th of June at the Old Fruit Market in Glasgow. We've got a couple of articles now about the awards on our blog, and the first one I wrote a couple of weeks ago was off the back of just getting a wee bit of feedback from clients in here in the studio about the fact that there's a cost to nominate your podcast for the Scottish Podcast Awards, £59 plus VAT. And there's a wee bit of pushback from a couple of our clients about the fact that the award organisers have charged, or going to charge, podcasters to enter. And I did a wee bit of thinking about it, and I did a bit of research into what it costs to enter podcast awards in different parts of the world. And I asked Claude, you know, the AI agent, to do me a report on the benefits of putting yourself forward for a podcast award. So there's a blog article about that you can find over on our blog. But it's an exciting time of year, because what I noticed about the launch event for the Scottish Podcast Awards, which I think was it November last year, some point in November last year, it was actually a cracking night. And we went along to it, Cam and I from the studio, we went along. We saw quite a number of our clients there. We saw quite a number of people who'd been guests of our clients. They were also at the event. But what was really, really interesting was the live interaction between Scottish podcasters, a lot of whom had never met each other before. So it was like the first time they'd all been in the same room together. And I kind of flashed back in my mind to back in the early days of podcasting here in the UK. So I started podcasting March 2005, and really quickly the UK had quite a thriving podcast community, and we had our own forum. I can't for the life of me remember what Britpod, was it called Britpod? We had a forum. It was a husband and wife team, Neil and Jen. that started this forum, and it was great. You could go on and talk to other podcasters. You could promote your own episodes. You could appear as guests or send promos to other UK podcasters to run on their podcasts. And it was great, and there was a couple of meetups. In fact, the world's first podcast conference, it was a one-day event down in London, took place, I think, September 2005. That was before any other country or any other region in the world had organised its podcasters to come together in one room. The UK did it back in 2005, and it was a great event. And the reason I'm mentioning it is because at the launch event for the Scottish Podcast Awards, it reminded me of those times where podcasters would get together in the same room and just chat to each other. Since 2005, as a society, we're chronically online. So maybe there's a sense of like meeting up isn't really something that's kind of needed or that we do too much anymore. But back then, we weren't as chronically online as we are now. And it was great just meeting up with other podcasters, people that you might have been listening to, people that you might admire, getting the chance to meet them. So I think it's actually a pretty exciting time, and it's taken to 2026 for Scotland to get its own awards recognition for Scottish podcasters. The British Podcast Awards have been about for quite a while. They charge an entry fee. So it's not unusual for that to be the case. There's going to be an event held at the Fruit Market on the 26th of June where you can go along and meet loads of other podcasters. I think there's going to be live music. There'll be alcohol. It's an event, and it's in Scotland, of course. So I'd love to know what you guys think of the Scottish Podcast Awards and the fact that it costs £59 plus VAT to enter. Now, as I said, excuse me, it still feels pretty early in the morning to be doing this. Let me just quickly find the article on our blog. Okay, so yeah, this is the piece I pulled together. Now, I'm going to issue a disclaimer. I believe I issue on this blog post and the other blog post about the Scottish Podcast Awards that I'll mention in a minute. At the studio, we have absolutely no affiliation with the Scottish Podcast Awards at all. Now, I've met one of the co-organisers, Scott. He came in to see us in the studio just to get myself and Cam's view on the awards itself, what the Scottish podcasting landscape looks like. But we have no involvement with them. We're not part of any element of it at all. We're not nominating ourselves or any podcast that we're involved with for an award. I'm not a judge. Cam's not a judge. We're not part of the media team in any way. We just think it's a great idea for Scotland. But anyway, there's this article on our blog, should you enter the Scottish Podcast Awards, the ROI or the return of investment case for Scotland's podcasters. And I've broken down what that £59 plus VAT entry fee is actually going to get you. And one of the things that a lot of people are perhaps overlooking is point 3 on this list, the sponsorship leverage. A lot of clients we speak to are interested in getting sponsors or advertisers for their podcast. One of the things that you need to do, and we've got a whole article about getting sponsorship on our blog, one of the things you need to do is differentiate yourself from the competition, from what's out there in the market. I think it's hard to think of, excuse me, I think it's hard to think of a better way to differentiate yourself from the podcasting marketplace than if you have either been nominated, shortlisted, or been given an award for your podcast. So that's one of the points that I make in this blog post, is the potential sponsorship leverage. You could be looking at a 15 to 30% deal increase. So, and as a working example there on the blog, if you're charging £200 per podcast episodes, a 15 to 30% increase could mean an extra £30 to £60 per episode. Over 12 episodes, that's approaching 720 quid at the higher end of that increase. So you've already exceeded your £59 plus VAT investment by entering the wards, just by being able to get back more sponsorship leverage. But whether you decide to enter or not, oh my goodness, whether you decide to enter or not, I think it's worth at least going to the event, you know. Just to be in the same room as other podcasters. There's something very affirming about being in a room full of people who are passionate about the same things that you are. Christopher McDonald, in the comments, your articles have been insightful, mate. I appreciate you sharing them. No, I'm glad you've enjoyed them. And he also holds his hands up. He says, Christopher says, I was a vocal sceptic of the pricing initially, but that was a knee-jerk reaction. We have since paid our entry fee to submit into one category. That's good to know, Christopher. And if you're at the event, it'll be good to catch up with you in June. So yeah, I think that whole concept of sitting in the same room with people who are passionate about podcasting, just sharing experiences, offering to be guests on each other's podcasts. You know, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but back in the day, the way that you got more listeners or potential listeners for your podcast was by recording a short promo and sending it to other podcasters to play on theirs. That doesn't really get done anymore. But it was just a way of relationship building, you know, a wee short promo. You would send it to the podcasters that you hoped you could get in front of their audience. And if they played it, quite often you would see a wee uptick in the number of listeners you would get in your podcast. And that made me think, when I was thinking about that, it made me think about whether there's a concept in Scotland of being overly protective of our listener base and assuming that if we have 100 listeners, we can't share those 100 listeners with another podcast. I don't know whether that's the case or not, but if it is, I think it's pretty short-sighted, you know. Nobody's stealing from your plate, and there are more than enough podcast listeners in Scotland to go around. Which leads me on to something that I posted on our X account this morning. You can follow us at Podcast Glasgow. Now, this data is taken from a Pod News article, which we'll come to in a second, which claims that Scotland leads the UK in podcast listening. Scotland is the most podcast-hungry nation in the UK. 23.3% of Scottish adults tune every week, which is apparently higher than England, Wales, or Northern Ireland. Now, here's the article, and again, it's circling back to the Scottish Podcast Awards. So this came out November 28th last year. And that bit of data, 23.3% of adults in Scotland listen to podcasts weekly. And they claim that data is higher than the rest of the UK nations. To be honest with you, it sounds good. It sounds good. But unfortunately, I can't find any official data to back that up. Ofcom doesn't have anything about it being Scotland having a higher number of listeners. But you know what? Who cares, right? We'll just throw that number out there. Sounds good. It sounds good. And as I say, this is taken from a Pod News article press release about the launch of the Scottish Podcast Awards. So here's a question. How do you prepare your entry for the Scottish Podcast Awards? And do you care? How much time and effort are you going to put into it? There could be a wee bit of a kind of tall poppy syndrome thing that we have as Scots, where we kind of don't really want to be recognised for being that good. It sounds weird me saying that out loud because it's pretty much a thought that I have in my head, but there, I'm saying it out loud. You know, North American podcasters, for example, if they win a podcast award, I'm sure they have no problem shouting about it for the rooftops. But do we as Scots maybe get a wee bit embarrassed? I don't know. But anyway, over on our blog, I've written an article, How to Prepare Your Entry for the Scottish Podcast Awards. Now, you see the opening paragraph. I'll say it again. I have no relationship with the Scottish Podcast Awards. Its founders, the judges, Go Radio, who is the official media partner. I haven't been asked to write it. I've no inside knowledge of what the judging criteria is. I have asked. I haven't been provided with that information. So all I can work off is my producer's perspective. So if I have my producer hat on here in the podcast studio Glasgow, it's the hat that I wear every day. It's a hat that I've worn for many, many years. I would have to ask myself, if I was a judge on the Scottish Podcast Awards, what would I be looking for? So I've broken down the reasons here on the blog, and let's just quickly go over them. And this might be useful to anyone who's considering entering the Scottish Podcast Awards. First of all, your podcast needs to have a clear reason to exist. So that's that whole, in a single sentence, why does your podcast exist? So if it's something specific, if you're covering Scottish football, if you're giving a voice to Scottish businesses, if you're talking about Scottish history, podcasts that have got a clear reason to exist make better editorial decisions, they attract a more committed audience, and they're easier to evaluate as a judge because you understand immediately what they're trying to do and whether they're doing it. Now, I don't want to sound unkind here, right? But if your podcast is just you and your pal from hot yoga talking about the week that you just had, right, okay, there's probably a reason for that to exist, but it's maybe not quite as tangible. So, for example, one of our clients is a testicular cancer charity called Cojones, and they have an amazing podcast called Check 1 2, which is just a great name for a testicular cancer podcast. They have a very, very clear reason to exist because the podcast is there to help educate men and their partners about testicular cancer, the importance of self-checking, what going through treatment for testicular cancer looks like, what's involved, what the recovery and the aftermath and the adjustment to life after such treatment is like. So that's a very clear reason that podcast has to exist. You're going to be looking for something similar for your podcast when you submit it as an entry to be considered for an award at the Scottish Podcast Awards. Consistency is the other thing. You put out a great episode once, maybe twice, that's fantastic. But the judges will almost certainly be listening to more than one of the episodes of your podcast. So there has to be that consistency. Reliably great, consistently good format, consistently fantastic audio quality, great editorial standards. The podcast is tightly edited and produced. That's the sort of thing that matters, that consistency. That matters to the judges, but it also matters to your audience. Just a consistently well-produced, great sounding podcast is really important. Now, you've noticed that I'm not talking about video, the visuals here. As far as I'm aware, the podcast judging criteria won't include the video component because podcasts are and always have been audio first. That takes me on to another key consideration, and that's audio quality. So poor audio quality isn't just distracting, it's completely off-putting with a podcast. It's got to be the number one way that you will both lose or just be unable to retain any kind of listenership to your podcast. So if the judges are listening to your podcast and the audio quality is consistently garbage, it's going to be really difficult for them to positively evaluate your podcast. So get that audio quality right. The hosting of the podcast is also important. That's something that we try and instill in our clients, is to ask the questions that the audience listening want to ask. And we've all experienced that. You're listening to a podcast, the guest starts relating a particular story or anecdote or revelation or shares a piece of information, and you start thinking of the follow-up questions you want to hear the host asking. So a good interview-led podcast will have a host who's able to ask the first, the second, the third, but the previously unasked fourth question. So if you're hosting a podcast that's interview-based, you really need to start thinking about that kind of interview technique where you really do ask the questions that the audience are interested in. Bad hosts talk too much, they interrupt too much, they ignore what the guest has just said and then take the conversation in a completely different direction. So if the hosting standard is one of the criteria that you'll be judged on, and I don't know if it is, but it might be, then, going forward, you really need to think about the quality of your hosting, really evaluate honestly whether you feel you're doing a good job or not. And because it's the Scottish Podcast Awards, there has to be some sort of genuine connection with a Scottish audience or subject matter. So that's going to be something related to Scotland in some way, that is people, stories, communities, culture. That connection should be clear in the content. Because I think it would be a bit of a shame if the shortlists were announced for, I think there's 27 categories, and those shortlists were just full of generic, repurposed, repackaged mainstream media audio content. And that's not really a rant, it's just me being honest. I would love to see all of the nominees, or the majority of the nominees in the shortlist, be independent Scottish podcasts. The independent ones that aren't affiliated with the BBC, STV, mainstream newspapers. Why? I think it goes back to the fact that the technology behind podcasting was created in direct response to the amount of control the mainstream, quote unquote mainstream, has over information. And I'm not going to do a big history lesson into the origins of podcasting, but that's the reality. The world's first podcaster, Adam Curry, he had a stinger that ran on his podcast, which poked fun at the FCC and needing licenses to be able to broadcast. Podcasting stripped that away. It democratised the distribution of audio content. And I think still today, 22 years later, the independent component of podcasting is something that should be celebrated. So, yeah, the Scottish Podcast Awards, let me just quickly check when it doesn't say. For some reason, I had it in my head that it was the 9th of March. It might be because, the ceremony itself is taking place on the 26th of June. So the judges need plenty of lead time to actually judge the nominees. Yeah, there we go. It's right there. 9th of March is the entry deadline, and that's when the judging commences. Let's have a look at who the judges are. Excuse me. Says the judges are listed there. There's a wee bit more information about each of them, I believe. Let's have a quick look. Yeah, there we go. So you want to know who the judges are, who you will be wooing with your podcast come the 9th of March when the judging commences. So that's pretty much all I've got to say about the Scottish Podcast Awards on this live stream. Just quickly take you through the titles of some articles that we've got on our blog that you might find interesting. We've got one here, how to get podcast sponsors, aimed particularly at the Scottish market. There's a few articles that came out last week, let me check, or in fact yesterday, about the kind of technical side of podcasting, particularly video podcasts, multi-camera versus single camera podcasts. What's the difference between them? Why, if you record direct to camera, you're going to give yourself a bit of a post-production nightmare. I do a bit of a dive into 3 different podcast hosting platforms, Buzzsprout, Spotify and RSS.com. The ideal podcast length for 2026 is also covered. If you are being invited on as an interviewee on a podcast, I've got a guide on how to prepare for it. A couple of more articles going into the kind of technical side of things to do with gain boosters for microphones. And there's an article there on the top 5 AI tools for podcasters in 2026. So podcaststudioglasgow.com, click on For Podcasters, then the blog, and tons of resources there. There's more coming soon. And in the meantime, I'm going to thank the folk that watched this live. Christopher McDonald says, yeah, I plan on attending the Scottish Podcast Awards. Any excuse to pop down to Glasgow again and meet like-minded people. So cheers for you guys, or cheers to you guys who've been watching the live. It's a wee bit of an experiment from me here in the Podcast Studio Glasgow. It's absolutely freezing in this small studio that I'm in. I can't have the heater running because it's a bit too noisy while I'm streaming. But I'm planning to do more of these, and if you've enjoyed it, hit the thumbs up or whatever it is that you do on LinkedIn, and I'll hopefully do another again soon, so just watch out for the alert notification that I'll be going live. If you have any questions, follow up with comments on this video, or you can send me a direct message on LinkedIn, and I hope you guys have a fantastic Tuesday.